Okay. Okay. It's Thursday morning, and welcome to day 4 of the GIAN course on post-colonial eco-criticism. And we will start right with lecture 10. But before I get to that, I promise to come back briefly. I will try to be brief on just a couple of points from the writers I did not have time for yesterday. And those are Wole Soyinka and Tsitsi Dangarembga, and perhaps very, very briefly, not doing her justice, Chimamanda Adichie. And I think it's helpful to think about these. We're always looking for connections between these writers, after all. So Wole Soyinka, in his that famous work I mentioned, actually it's 1976, so it's quite some time ago. Myth, Literature, and the African World. I will just mention a couple of parts. I didn't do justice to it yesterday, and you were probably a little confused because I was mentioning the god Ogun, the Yoruba god. But his point is more a Pan-African idea of how the West, or outsiders, anyone, it doesn't have to be the Western Academy, can be more sensitive to local belief systems, right? And he is really, I guess one of the points I wanted to share was he has been trying to create an African cosmogony, right, that allows for this indigenous critique we were talking about. So he doesn't want to get rid of all the Western tropes or paradigms or concepts. So let me just say this, and then I'll move on. So this Ogun myth, and you don't have to remember it, but what's interesting is some of these, like Sango, a couple of these gods, from my understanding, limited understanding, reappear in the southern U.S. and in the Caribbean in the form of voodoo, which comes from Western Africa. Because the slaves came from mostly Western Africa, so you have some of those gods reappearing. And when we get to the African American lecture, I'll say something more about that. So he says that he wants to create this coherent African cosmology to decenter the European mythology and sort of Judeo-Christian critique, which is nothing wrong. It fits Europe, but it doesn't speak to his area. So it's a decentering of an alien vision that involves a necessary part of authentic modernization, which may be a contradiction in terms, but that's what he's after. So I wanted to share that. If you're interested, that work is rather dense. I haven't read all of it, to be honest. So I like to read interpretations of it. But it has been influential. And then now we come to, as I mentioned, here's the other writer that I just finished teaching again for the third time. And one of my favorite novels is Nervous Conditions, 1988, by Tsitsi Dangarembga. And she, of course, as I said, titles her book. Her book's title comes from a phrase in Wretched of the Earth, right? And she has the epigraph there. And she's a trained psychologist. And Fanon, as we've been talking about, says the condition of the native is a nervous condition. That's the line she quotes. What is fascinating is that she does a wonderful job of showing how anxiety, nervousness wrought by the upheaval of the colonial encounter, of colonialism, how that affects both an individual and a culture. It affects an individual in unique ways, but there are these broad ways of thinking about the culture. This takes place in Zimbabwe, which of course was Rhodesia at the time. The time is so Zimbabwe becomes independent and changes its name in 1980. The novel is published in 1988, but it's set in the late 60s. So again, we have a child's eye view mostly, and we have her cousin, and this is fascinating. Her cousin has lived 3 years in England because her uncle, this narrator's name is Thambu, and her uncle has got risen, right, within the colonial apparatus. And he's risen to a respected, learned English, get educated. So he goes to England to get a master's degree so that his daughter, who's just a year or so older than the narrator, becomes really confused because she's now anglicized, and she comes back and she has anorexia nervosa, which tends to be a sort of Western phenomenon. It could be genetic partly, they think. But in any case, the point is she's refusing to eat. So that becomes a symbol as well as a reality, right? I mean, we are symbolic creatures, right? So we say, I'm hungry for knowledge. There's a reason for that. So she actually is hungry. She studies, but she refuses to eat because that's her way of resisting her parents, who want her to fit they expect, I've had friends go through this, so they expect her to suddenly switch and move right back into the traditional cultural system, right? And that's very unfair to someone who's a formative age. So that's what I like. The other thing is it does deal with education, which is a huge theme. And it's always that ambivalence, right, about the education. Now, that's still the British system. So clearly it's an anglicized and a biased education. But nonetheless, she doesn't paint it like it's nuanced. So there are some, English people who are helpful, some aren't, and so forth. But I think the other thing is there's a theme of bilingualism, how that shapes your identity, perhaps. And there's also, if you're interested, the motif of food is an important part of post-colonial writing. This is not directly eco-criticism, but I just thought I would mention it. My former mentor, Paroma Roy, has written alimentary tracts. Tracts is a pun, T-R-A-C-T, tracts, but also written things. And so food is really powerful in all these novels, even Laurel Hodge, as I mentioned the other day. So I think those are the main things I wanted to mention. If you're interested, I would always be happy to talk more about this. So Tsitsi Dangaremga's 1988 book, Nervous Conditions. Finally, just a nod to Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie's Purple Hibiscus. The only novel I've taught two novels by her, neither of which is this. One is Americana, and one is Half of a Yellow Sun, about the Nigerian Civil War I mentioned. And in all of these, I think, even in Dangaremga's book, landscape comes up, because the narrator grows up poor, having to, they are subsistence farmers. They grow corn, right, which is not even native to their culture. And they have to eke out this living. And then when they see the opportunity for a scholarship to a mission school, that's like, a godsend in the 1960s. So landscape, we looked at Ngugi's The River Between, right? This idea of landscape. When we get, if you remind me, when we get to the Native American writers today, M. Scott Momaday, I will show an image of an indigenous map drawn in the 19th century by a Native American. there are different ways to produce maps, right? We think there's only one way now. So, Adichie's novel is a coming-of-age story about, again, characters going through psychological and moral growth from childhood to adulthood, again, right? That happens a lot. Some of you may have read this, and I don't know how, I can't really judge how it compares to her other works. It's Americana's been a huge bestseller because, of course, it deals with America and the West to some degree. But in this one, I think we have a 15-year-old who is a teenage girl. Again, these are another note to make is these are women writers. So we have the focus on women, domesticity, and those who resist that, right? And it doesn't matter what class you are, right? There are characters who are going to rebel, like Lucia in Dangaremga's novel. And she, again, is sort of outshadowed by her sort of respected father, who's a philanthropist, and so forth. Religion makes an appearance to some degree, Catholicism, as it does in many of these novels, right? By the way. So let me just see, I won't go over it more, but one of the characters moves to America, so we do have this kind of cross-cultural experience, but we also have people who deteriorate psychologically, and I think that's fascinating, that the psychological angle, and that these are women writers because the pressures, they're confined so often, right? And we know that from feminist writing, even in Victorian England, British writing, and so on. So I think that comes into play. As far as the landscape, it's not directly about that. And I don't think Adichie talks about that directly, so I'm not going to force an eco-critical reading. But I think it's useful to keep the title in mind, right? Which is, after all, a flower. So a floral motif that can be interpreted in different ways. So there are ways to read that. Okay, but now to today's lecture per se is African American Voices. And did the still going on? Okay, that's fine. I can wait. Yeah. Okay, so as I was saying, now to specifically Lecture 10, African American Voices, Jean Toomer's Cain. Jean is a male writer, and this book came out in 1923 as part of the Harlem Renaissance, which was infused, interestingly enough, by many Caribbean writers, not all, and had a number of women writers, which again was rare at the time. It was I've taught, for example, classic canonical American works like The Great Gatsby, which is a great novel, which came out in 1925. But Fitzgerald had no clue about the Harlem Renaissance, right? So some of the writers like Langston Hughes become important later on and do attract attention. Cain was appreciated by his peers, but did not really gain traction until maybe a generation later. And now is considered a classic. For some context, some of you know this, but W.E.B. Du Bois, The Souls of Black Folk, came out in 1903, a classic still, has always been in print. What's interesting about Cain and Du Bois's work is that they are multi-genre, they're hybrid texts, because Du Bois was a sociologist, he was a professor. an African American professor, very eloquent, right? He wrote academic books, but in this book, he wanted to reach a larger audience and also to capture something of the spirit of what it meant to be African American. That's hard to do, right? So I'm giving you Du Bois because this is important context. So about 20 years before Cain, you have Du Bois, and you can't really talk about African American literature without talking about Du Bois, who coined the famous term double consciousness, right? For how African Americans still have to learn. We know this everywhere in the world. There are certain groups that have to learn to traverse and learn the idioms and the mannerisms of the elite, of the dominant group, even though in their own homes and so forth and communities, they would have a different way of talking. That, he said, is a burden, but it also can be empowering, because then you can, after all, it's like being bilingual, in a sense. The other reason to mention Du Bois is which is related to Cain, is he has a lot of songs in there. African American spirituals, or gospel, maybe you've heard of this. This is really what shaped rock music and the blues. That's some African American, right? You would not have rock music or pop music and all this stuff without African American music. Jazz is a big part of this, right? Jazz is improvisational, right? We know this in Indian music. You have a riff, as they say in African American lingo, and then you play with that, right? So no one performance is the same. How do you do that in writing? I don't know. You can do that with a drama, with plays. But with writing, you can approximate the spontaneity. You can't really do it, but you can have characters who are doing it. You can describe characters. But I think this hybrid genre of having songs, right, spirituals, and then sort of straight narration, commentary, those kinds of things, right? So Cain has aphorisms. It has beautiful poems. I'll read a little bit for you. It has prose, and it's almost like a mix of some of the same characters. For example, we have the short story tradition of the linked short story. There are different names for that, right? We have Dubliners by Joyce. Sort of the same milieu, set in the same. Faulkner does that. He sometimes has some of the same characters. So what he does here is similar, except now it's different genres. So song becomes is very important to African American. To this day, for example, African American choirs don't use written music, right? My friends in the African American choirs don't know how to read the music, and that because they don't need it. Whereas all the white singers, yeah, and it's like we can't do anything without the text, and so it's this idea of orality still there, and this is where some African American theorists have really brilliantly tried to, like Henry Louis Gates Jr., have tried to theorize this. So Cain, let me just read a bit of this. And again, I think there are so many wonderful interpretations of this, so I can't do justice to them. But this is called Harvest Song. And think about the title, Cain. Now, this is someone writing in New York City, right? He has not really worked in the fields. And I will show you two images in just a minute to clarify this. I am a reaper whose muscles set at sundown. All my oats are cradled, but I am too chilled and too fatigued to bind them, and I hunger. I crack a grain between my teeth, I do not taste it. I have been in the fields all day, my throat is dry. I hunger. Notice the repetition. My eyes are caked with dust of oat fields at harvest time. I am a blind man who stares across the hills. Environment. Seeking stacked fields of other harvesters. It would be good to see them. Crooked, split, and iron-ringed handles of the scythes. It would be good to see them dust-caked and blind. I hunger. Dusk is a strange, feared sheath their blades are dulled in. My throat is dry. And should I call a cracked grain like the oats? ... Eho. He uses a kind of, I think, an approximation of an African expression, right? It's not, as my understanding, it's not very American. I fear to call. What should they hear me? And offer me their grain, oats, or wheat, or corn? I have been in the fields all day. I fear I could not taste it. I fear knowledge of my hunger. My ears are cracked with dust of oat fields at harvest time. So the repetition, right? Song-like. I am a deaf man who strains to hear the calls of other harvesters whose throats are also dry. It would be good to hear their songs. Reapers of the sweet-stalked cane, cutters of the corn, even though their throats cracked and the strangeness of their voices deafened me. I hunger, my throat is dry, now that the sun has set and I am chilled, I fear to call. Eh-ho, my brothers, I am a reaper, eh-ho, all my oats are cradled, but I am too fatigued to bind them and I hunger. I crack a grain, it has no taste to it, my throat is dry. Oh, my brothers, I beat my palms still soft against the stubble of my harvesting. You beat your soft palms too. My pain is sweet, sweeter than the oats or wheat or corn. It will not bring me knowledge of my hunger. If we had time, we could explore all the imagery there, right? That is fascinating, very interesting, right? Now, one thing to keep in the back of our minds I don't have an answer for is why there were Harlem Renaissance writers who were publishing straight poetry like Langston Hughes, right? Poetry volumes. Many. Claude McKay, and others. But he chooses to have this hybrid text. So this is a song-like part of Cain. There are prose-like parts. So partly one could argue that he is trying to emblematize or put on display was I doing that? Put on display this idea of hybridity, of mixed cultures. After all, these are genres that the mainstream press has imposed, right? You can do a poetry anthology, you can do this, but he says no. And Du Bois did the same. He also said he was experimenting. The other thing I would just say is the cane, C-A-N-E, has to do with then the sugar cane, right? But here's a writer who has not worked in the fields himself, but and by the way, he was also interestingly enough kind of could sometimes pass for a non-African American. Do you know what the word passing? There's a great novel, Nella Larsen's novel, which was just reissued recently. Passing, and then she has a book called Quicksand. So that colorism is present. So why choose Cain? Because in a way that haunts the African American experience. After all, 1923, they're not that far removed from slavery. Literally, slavery is abolished officially by Lincoln in 1863, but they don't hear about it till 1865. Today, now we have a national holiday in the U.S. called Juneteenth, which is the day on which they received the news. Because the Southern forces weren't defeated until 65, they refused to set them free, and so finally they only learned 2 years later that there was this emancipation. So today, which is a good sign, right? They do this, they have Juneteenth. So when you think about it, that's only, 60, 70 years later, 60 years. The parents of some of the Harlem Renaissance writers had been slaves. That's astonishing, right? So what haunts them are the plantations. So I have two images I'll just like to show, which could serve for all of the African American, so many writings, not all. And those images are the plantation slave labor. One's a painting, and one is a painting of sort of contemporary time, like from the 19th century. Yeah. And you'll see that it's very 19th century style, that one. And you can see they're picking cotton in the South, right? By the way, this had some things to do with globalized trade with India because the British couldn't get their cotton from the South anymore, so they turned to India and Egypt and other places. And then the other image is, that's the actual slave labor on a plantation. And then the next image, you'll see a nice quaint picture of a plantation owner's house. Now, in the southern U.S., some especially white people, like to have wedding pictures here without really thinking about the history, even though the history is told there, and you can see that. I was at the University of Virginia many years ago, and Thomas Jefferson founded that university. And when I was there in the 1980s, the tour guides never talked about that he owned slaves. By the late 1990s, they did. So that's progress, right? Because there are slave quarters, right? Okay, so the plantation, on the one hand, you have, so these are opposing views. You have the plantation is, like as Fanon said, a space divided in two, right? You have the fancy home, like the manors of England, created on the backs of slaves, and you have also African Americans know this very well, house slaves and field slaves. When Malcolm X was taught, you can watch some of his videos. I don't know if you know Malcolm X, yeah. And his autobiography is great, but you watch some of his videos and interviews, and he'll talk straight off, like it is, about the house. So someone who's in modern times a house slave, they don't use it much anymore. They sometimes say an Uncle Tom from Uncle Tom's Cabin is kind of a cop-out, a kind of a sellout, because they are seen as having, remember we talked about the post-colonial term, I just slipped my mind, not compadre, but the idea of the comprador, the compromised one, right? So in the same way, some African Americans will still turn to this. It's kind of fading away now, the new generation. These terms, it's not in the popular lingo, but certainly it's still around. So I thought I'd mention that. So think about, that's interesting. You have, thank you for those images. That's fine. So you have Gene Toomer not having experienced that directly, but it haunts him, perhaps his parents, right? Some of these writers, their parents, some came from the Caribbean, and they did grow up surrounded by this. Still, of course, the laborers were paid ostensibly very little, but it's still a very harsh existence. So the African American experience is, I think if you were to look at a survey, which independent of post-colonial eco-criticism, you would have to take into account Frederick Douglass, for example, the slave narratives, as they're called, the autobiographies of slaves, starting with Olaudah Equiano from the late 1700s, but especially in the American context with Frederick Douglass, who escapes at a young age, gets educated, and then ends up being a friend of Abraham Lincoln. So these are very powerful images. The Harlem Renaissance, of course, also coincides with, no, it doesn't quite coincide. in the 1930s, after the Depression, and especially after World War II, there was a great migration from the South of African Americans to the cities. So when we think of African Americans, we often think of urban, right? So until recently, eco-criticism was not seen as pertinent. But writers and scholars have shown that's not true. You don't have to experience as an author yourself the conditions that you describe, because after all, that's why we have writing. It's the imagination. But your people can be haunted by this. So the theme of haunting and ghosts is very powerful. There was also a great anthropologist you may have heard of called Zora Neale Hurston, who wrote a book in the 1930s called Of Mules and Men, in which she collected from her hometown hundreds of stories, folk stories. She was educated at Columbia University. She also wrote the classic work, Their Eyes Were Watching God. James Baldwin, Richard Wright, Lorraine Hansberry, Gwendolyn Brooks. I'm going through a list of names. Ralph Ellison. I know that some of you know Amritjit Singh, who is a noted scholar of African American writing, started at the University of Rajasthan here, became noted in the U.S., and he's long retired now, but his advisor was Ralph Ellison, the great writer. So that's pretty neat, right? As a young student, he got Ralph Ellison. If you're interested to get a sense of the civil rights struggle, you might look at Selma, the film, 2014 film of the civil rights struggle. Now, I do not want to stray from this idea of post-colonial eco-criticism. How does post-colonial studies help in this? And I certainly haven't mentioned so many names here. Because we also have post-apocalyptic novels by Octavia Butler, for example, who's African-American. She died relatively young in her 50s, but her books are, and they got a renewed life after the pandemic, right? As different as all these texts are, they do often share this, they definitely share the idea of injustice and justice, right? Race, these kinds of things. And so you could go from Jean Toomer to Octavia Butler, 1980s, 50 years, 60 years, 70 years difference, and very different, but sharing this impetus. So landscape becomes big because to this day, there are a number of African Americans, because of the Great Migration, they think of the South, that's the ambivalence, because the South was the plantation, right? But it's their homeland, they consider it. That's interesting, right? We talk about what homeland means. And homeland does not have to be somewhere you've been for 1,000 years, right? Very few people have stayed in one place for 1,000 years. So what is homeland? That's something else to think about. And I think all these novels explore that. So the other aspect that I'd like to talk about here is, I'll just read a couple of snippets from scholars who, histories of the plantation, to show you how graphic they are, and then I'm going to turn to Toni Morrison. And sometimes this is useful to pair just some examples of this with these novels. So here's an example of how horrific the slave conditions were, like in the 1850s, told by freed slaves many decades later, right? In the time of the Harlem Renaissance, they're still being interviewed. So this was what one slave, of course, as it's been set down, dictated. So on the plantation, the younger children were fed from a trough. that was 20 feet in length. All the enslaved children stood back until the master had finished stirring the food, and then at a given signal they dashed to the trough where they began eating with their hands. Some even put their hands in the trough and ate. There were times when the master's dogs and some of the pigs that ran around the yard all came to the trough to share these meals. Mr. Womble, whoever that is, states that they were not permitted to strike any of these animals so as to drive them away, and so they protected their faces from the tongues of the intruders by placing their hands on the sides of their faces as they ate. And remember this idea of animal imagery, right? So this is of course the worst kind of thing, is slavery, right? Where you, in a sense, animalize, if we're going to use animal in the conventional sense of dehumanizing. We can talk about animal studies at another time. And that's how these slaves were seen, right? During the meal, the master walked from one end of the trough to the other to see that all is as it should be. So that's a graphic image of there I wanted to share with you. Here's another kind of image that was experienced by Harriet Tubman, who's a famous escaped slave who became a famous abolitionist and social activist. In fact, there was talk about 10 years ago of putting her on one of the U.S. currency bills, and I thought that might happen, but administrations changed. Here's where eco-criticism. You can see this is what haunts these writings. The disabled Tubman went to work on a timber gang, so logging, exhibiting great skill in the logging camps and in the fields. There she was exposed to the secret communication networks that were the province of black watermen and other free and enslaved blacks. As one of the few women working in the forests on a timber gang, mostly it was men, Tubman became part of an exclusively male world. Here in the forests, beyond the watchful eye of the white masters, the male slaves had access to the free black watermen and black mariners. And these black men were part of a larger world, a world beyond the plantation, beyond the woods, that reached out to towns and cities. They knew the safe places. They knew the sympathetic whites, and more important, they knew the danger. They created a veiled and secret world parallel to the white master's world. So that's one part of this, right? So you have the forests where they were willing to brave whatever dangers there were. I don't think there were any really dangerous predators or something, but nonetheless you had to scrape for your food and so forth, but at least you were free, right? So that also is in the background here. And the idea of I just was trying to think of what was I going to say. Yes. So what Toni Morrison has said in a famous essay from 1992, it was actually a series of lectures called Playing in the Dark, which Richard Wright had said some similar things years before, the famous writer, that blackness has been a necessary part of the construction of whiteness. You know how sometimes you define yourself, right, in contrast to someone else, alterity, othering. Well, blackness was sort of the way that they could, not all whites, but generally, this is generally how America was structured, was even the writing. So she looks at classic writers whom she likes. She was actually an editor, right? Famous editor as well for a publishing house. Willa Cather, Ernest Hemingway, and so on. She looks at these white writers and can sort of make, just by little word mentions here and there, you can infer that, even if the blacks are invisible, sometimes they're mentioned, but even if they're invisible, you can infer that this depends on these structures. I was talking with someone about the Sublime and Edmund Burke's idea, right? Do you remember, if you've read the Sublime, how he talks about the black child and, this is the negation of whiteness. it's the same idea. But the thing is, in America, it was never said so boldly. It was sort of construed because, yeah, it was. They knew something told them that this was not right to say out loud. Okay, Toni Morrison's Beloved. I don't know how many of you have read it, but it's one of the great novels of American writing in the 20th century. 1987, the story of a post-Civil War in the 1870s, a family that is in a house that they believe is haunted by a malevolent spirit. Remember the motif of haunting, right? But this is not really a magic realist novel. But nonetheless, there is a sense, it's clear that the ghost that appears at some point in the novel, which is that they call Beloved, this is what the mother calls her, is real to these, right? It's not like, oh, it's purely a psychological projection, but that's as far as that sort of supernatural goes, right? You can read it as psychological haunting, but I think it's also, well, the premise here, let me back up and say that there was something called the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 that the northern states kind of compromised and said, okay, if we have a runaway slave, we'll return, for a short time, they did this, they'll return it. Of course, there are always people working to help the slaves, right? This is called the Underground Railroad. But at the same time, the southern states got this enacted, right? And this is all a prelude to the Civil War. So it's set in 1873 where the mother is Sethi, who harbors a secret. She was formerly enslaved, and we have her, she has a daughter named Denver who lives with her, and for a short time, a mother-in-law named Baby Suggs. And there's also a good guy, a former slave named Paul D, who comes in, and he is sort of the voice of, he's not from the part of the family, so he can kind of bring a slightly more objective view into this. But one day they come and they see sitting on the doorstep Beloved. Now, those of you who know the novel will know this, but for those who don't, we find out she tells Paul D the story that she killed one of her own children because rather than have this child returned to slavery. So, infanticide by the mother is supposed to be the cardinal sin, right? But here's a woman who, did she do it? She did it out of love, right? So these ethical questions. And so what she feels is that this is the grown version of that child, that the ghost, Beloved. That's what she believes. We are never told whether, as I said, it's presented matter-of-factly. We're never told whether it's really that someone else but the point is, this was based on a real case that Morrison had read about. But she does this so brilliantly by talking about how this ghost haunts the novel. And I'll just, let me just read this summary from another, an online summary that was useful. So I thought I'll just read this. Sethi comes to believe that Beloved is the daughter she had killed because Beloved was the word, that's all she could afford on the gravestone. And so, you might say, some people would say, well, why didn't she kill herself, kind of thing. So these are all that, does feel guilt, but, she's, she does have this guilt, so she begins to spend all her time and money on this ghostly figure, and the ghost becomes demanding and angry. So you can read this psychologically, right? She becomes obsessed with this. She hardly eats. There's the food. While Beloved grows bigger and bigger. But not in a kind of Garcia Marquez kind of way. She just grows larger, and she looks like she's pregnant. Ultimately, there's that ambivalence too. Denver reveals her fear of Seti, having known that she killed Beloved, but not understanding why. And her brothers had run away, partly because of this. So Seti and Beloved's voices merge until they become indistinguishable. And Denver observes that Seti becomes more like a child, while Beloved seems more like a mother. Very interesting. So then they get some local African-American women to try to exorcise the ghost, to do rituals, right, to get it out, and so on. And Seti does show signs of, occasionally, of madness, right? And so one day, though, Beloved disappears. And Seti is devastated, right? And she says that Beloved was her best thing. Sort of meaning like that was the best thing that could happen, right? And Paul D says, no, you're your own best thing. And she goes, me? So it ends kind of there. So how do we interpret this? Well, ghosts in non-European expressive traditions can counter sort of Euro-American grand narratives of empiricism. We know this from interpretations of magical realism, right? That Garcia Marquez and others the maravilloso, the sort of the marvelous, right? The tradition, marvelous realism, as a Cuban Carpentier, the famous Cuban writer, coined the term. Whatever way you want to call it, it's a bit different from this, right? But nonetheless, in terms of how it's presented, but nonetheless, the ghost could be interpreted as sort of similar in the sense that these writers are taking folk traditions, right? The vernacular. These are not, educated and so forth, and they are making them real. You could see the enslaved child as one, as Avery Gordon says, who's written a wonderful 1997 work on ghosts, right? She's a sociologist, but she has a lot of literature in the book. Do you know, Isha, what the name of that is? You were nodding, but I can't remember the name of that book. Anyway, I hadn't thought to mention it, but it's a great book that I was reading recently. This is what she says. The enslaved child can be seen as metaphor, as weapon, as salve, as a fundamental epistemology for living in the vortex of North America. Interesting. That's a sociologist, right? And talking about literature, right? Ghostly Matters, yes, which is a very apt title. Yes. Thank you. Ghostly Matters, if you're interested. It's very readable. And it's been quite influential. Well, Morrison coined the term rememory, as you may know, to talk about not remembering in the classic way, but rememory in a kind of imaginative way to fill the gaps in history that the subaltern studies historians had always talked about, which is, remember those small stories, that the insignificant stories that never get told, women's stories, right? So rememory is how she sees part of her project as, and she has this interesting, it's a piece, short piece, 2019, called "I Wanted to Carve Out a World Both Culture Specific and Race Free." It's more like an interview. And she defines this as memory versus memorylessness. Rememory is in recollecting and remembering, as in reassembling the members of the body, the family, the population of the past. The effort to both remember and not know. Right? You can't know like in a sense of a fact. Thus, in Beloved, the ghost refuses to go away and thereby resists the premise of the oppositional logic of alterity that undergirds Eurocentric modernity, which continues to see the binary, right, the world through a center-periphery lens that mystifies borders, nations, and exile. Morrison's Ghost compels the reader to consider other ways of recording history, especially the history of people in a dominant society, who would rather forget this. And we see this now, as I said yesterday, enacted in textbooks in certain states. Not all states, about half the states. The very form of Morrison's novel resists the methodologies that rely on the reality-unreality. This, I know, is a big topic, realism and all of this, and I'm not, equipped. There's Riffater, sort of the French, is he French or British? Anyway, Riffater's fictional truth is, you can read a lot of sort of deconstructive criticism on this, but this really breaks that down, and so I'll just stop there, I think. Oh, I do want to quote Christine Gebhardt, who reads an African American slave narrative this way, and I think this will be a good way to conclude. Not conclude, but I have to find the rest of my pages. Nature is a place in which the black protagonist constitutes his subject position as he hides from the symbolic power of the white colonizer's gaze. Positioning himself in nature means positioning himself beyond the reach of forced location. And we saw that with the actual some of the slaves going into the forest. That's well documented. So, let me just collect my thoughts, my notes, I should say. I think those are the main things. The only other thing I wanted to mention was, I wanted to mention a couple other things. One is an important concept called the signifying monkey that I just alluded to yesterday, and then I realized that I didn't really do justice to it, by Henry Louis Gates Jr., a 1988 book, The Signifying Monkey. Now, signifying, we all know from linguistics, right? De Saussure, and then we go on to Derrida, and we get lost in Derrida and so forth. But the idea of how the sign systems. But there is a Native African American tradition which is about. Let's see. He uses the words signifying apostrophe, like he purposely drops the G, not in the title of the book, but in the inside, because that's the colloquial, and that distinguishes it from the linguistic, sort of the conventional linguistic sign system. And by this he means it's a concept of signification. Let's see. Gates plays off this idea of signifying and incorporates the linguistic concept of signifier and signified with the vernacular concept of signifying. So it takes the form of repetition, the alteration of another text. It has a bit of mimicry in it here, even though he doesn't mention it, which is it could encode admiration and respect. Not the, but it could also be sort of playful, tricksterish. So the trickster figure is a key part of this. It functions as a metaphor, signifying functions as a metaphor for formal revision, intertextuality within the African American vernacular system, but as rendered in writing. It can become a bit dense in term, because it's a bit slippery. But this comes off this idea in African American lingo of, I'm trying to find the word. It's a very common word. I'll come back to it if I remember it, but yeah. So this idea, For example, Ralph Ellison or revises or signifies upon Richard Wright's work, just as Ishmael Reed, a famous playwright and poet, who's still alive, I think, goes on to signify on both these writers. So you know how we have intertextuality, right? So here we have a kind of riffing. Do you know that from jazz? You kind of you improvise by being inspired by these other texts, to the point where in some traditions in the world, people have been accused of plagiarism, right? But plagiarism is a whole nother field that's interesting to think about because, as many writers have said, writers are thieves, right? They take the best ideas and recombine them. But that becomes, it's a legal issue, but it's also a cultural one. One of the things, if you think about maybe a better analog is rap music. Yeah, so rap, they actually have it started as something called the dozens, and they'd sit on these doorsteps and they'd have contests. They still do. And maybe you've seen these portrayed, contests in how good you are at rapping, right? If you've seen the play Hamilton, for example, it's all about that, right? That Lin-Manuel Miranda grew up in New York City, so it doesn't have to be only African Americans. So I want to, I think we're just about out of time. I think those were the main points I wanted to talk about. So just to reiterate, the idea of the haunting, the plantation is ambivalent. It is on the one hand, a place of labor and a scar, but on the other hand, this is quite ambivalent because on the other hand, that's kind of seen as a homeland because that's where your forebears came from, right? That's where all these songs that Du Bois and Toomer incorporate were formed. That's the paradox of humanity, right? And so to this day, and in fact, a lot of, I don't know if it's still happening, but maybe, I'm guessing maybe 10 years ago, I remember reading that there was all these, fairly doing well, young black professionals were moving from the northern cities back to the south because they could afford now to move where they want to move, right? They weren't moving as economic refugees, if that makes sense. So, interesting. Right. So what's haunting them, it doesn't mean it's a negative thing always. And then the other thing is this idea of spontaneity and riffing, and that Henry Louis Gates tries to talk about. So I think we'll stop there. I think those are the main points I wanted to make, and save your questions too for the end of today, if you have any, on these. And so that ends lecture 10. Thank you. I hope I had the right time. Okay. back, everyone. This will be lecture 11, the second lecture for today, day 4. This will be on Native American voices. And of course, as with all of these selections, I'm only looking at a couple of representative texts. So there is a huge variety in Native American literature if you're interested. Before I get to that, before I get to the specifics, one thing that we notice in a lot of indigenous writing, but also Native American writing, just as we looked at, for example, Easterine Kire's novel, Where the River Sleeps, the idea of shape-shifting, right, and animals. So the animal world is especially powerful. Anthropologists tell us this, but so do the novels and the literary works. So we may see some indication of that in the works we're looking at, but even if we don't, it's something that all Native American writing is aware of, and sort of the blurred boundaries between the human and non-human. So to that end, I would like to refer to a couple of other terms in eco-criticism. One was mentioned, someone was mentioning bioregionalism. So, right? So that's important because it occurred to me that Native American works, indigenous works, are particularly bioregional. What is bioregionalism? I'll just give a quick definition and then move on to one other term. So in the 1970s, this was conceived by sociologists to mean a particular place that people call or think of as their home that they identify with, which encompasses both the natural community, the natural surroundings, the environment, as well as the human community. The community is invested in the land, kind of like the land ethic that Aldo Leopold talks about, and shares a common way of life and sensibility shaped by that environment. That we see in a lot of Native American works. Or, conversely, we see the loss of that if it's set in urban environments. And this also resists the conventional dominant view of hierarchies and divisions. That is the ideal, in any case, of bioregionalism. And so it decenters those hierarchies, and it also it can show how rituals and customs reflect these ties to the land, these interconnections. For example, in the Hungry Tide, one could say that for the fisher folk who live there and earn their livelihood from it, the Sundarbans, the mangrove forests, constitute a bioregion, right? And so the tensions with outsiders is one of the many features of that novel. So when outsiders come in and don't understand the bioregion. So it's just one other concept to think about. Another one is, which I found a little slippery, but that has received a lot of attention in a book that came out 13 years ago called Eco-Ambiguity, and by Karen Thornburg. And she looks at Southeast Asian writing, which is her specialty, to describe literary works, both in the past and current, that do not directly address environmental crises, but which you can read as reflections of environmental crises. So by crises, we mean things I think we all understand: deforestation, the damming of rivers and displacement of people, which also disrupts the ecosystem, industrial pollution, climate change. We saw this with Gift in Green, right? Very similarly. So eco-ambiguity is what she calls the complex, contradictory interactions between people and the non-human environment. So sometimes they may interact with the environment in ways that seem counterproductive to their own interests, right? And so, how do you look at this? Sometimes you have to look at the zoom in and look very closely at a specific action, but then you have to look out and put it in the context of a larger action. I think the key word is ambiguity, rather than, because of the sciences from which eco-criticism has drawn so much of its original impetus and still does, is its whole premise is fact-based, right? Empirical, which is good. There's nothing wrong with that. It's just that it's a different way of relating to the world, which does not account for those nuances that humans bring to this, right? Which humans are complicated as well. And not all creatures also, or plants or animals or trees, act the same way. Finally, and more importantly, as I was alluding to, in Native American lore, animal studies is a big point. And I thought it would be useful to just mention that Peter Singer, the Australian philosopher, in 1975, oh, that's exactly 50 years ago, his book Animal Liberation. Interesting, because this follows the 1960s idea of civil rights, right? Not coincidentally, then we start to see, well, can we extend this, right? So he's a philosopher, so he looks at the logic of saying, he's a utilitarian. He follows Jeremy Bentham. And so he says, who argued famously that animal cruelty was similar to human slavery. And that the capacity to feel pain, not the power of reason, entitled a being to moral consideration, as Greg Girard puts it. So in other words, reason was still the part of the Enlightenment. I know this gets a bit philosophical, but bear with me. So how, by logic, we cannot say that animals don't feel pain. Now we know they feel emotion, and we keep finding out more and more how similar we are to at least some animals, non-human animals, as we should say, whether it's chimpanzees, whales, elephants, whatever. So Singer called this bias that we bring of anthropocentrism speciesism. Sometimes I see it come up, that word. Now, this is all from still a very European kind of model, but it's interesting how it does work. It does kind of fit with the indigenous worldview that sees these blurred boundaries. Another critic is Mary Midgley in 1983, talks about animal welfarism. So she's not going as far as Singer in saying that, you know, every animal is exactly this, has the same rights as all humans. She does, however, say that we have to think about. She is an animal rights person, but we have to think about what is good for that animal's habitat, right? And so there are other ways of looking at these. Science writers, it's interesting to see, are also turning to poetic words to try to express these, you know, there's a word called Umwelt, which is in that actually arose, a German, coined in the 70s also by a German scientist, to say how each organism reacts to the world. We have to understand that on their basis. It could be even a tiny organism. By the same token, then, we tend to see animals as reacting to the world in the ways we do. It's hard not to, but we cannot. We can no longer assume that. And then, of course, we come to Donna Haraway, whom I've mentioned. That leads us into posthumanism, because it begs the question of what human means, right? And that is a huge philosophical issue, and of course, many great people have talked about this, but again, if we are no longer entirely, if we think human is all about cells as well as consciousness, now we have, as we said, microplastics in us, or we have titanium legs, or whatever the case may be. And it's not a negative. She just says, well, we are cyborgs, right? So then the question becomes, how do we make, what are the ethics of that? And now we do have people, for example, I have a colleague who's a philosopher who does medical ethics. They have to constantly keep thinking, like now we have AI, right? Artificial intelligence. So by this, and analogously with issues of what is life, what is sentience, is someone in a vegetative state whose heart is pumping still alive, those kinds of things. So these are the questions that I think enter in. Not that we have to bring all those to bear on what we read in a literary text, but it's important to keep in mind the fact that what we naturally assume to be human may be just an assumption. Maybe. And I think that's what Native American texts on one level push us to think about. Right? They don't say come down on one side or the other. The other thing, though, I should say is the other thing is that when we look at animals, what Peter Singer said in looking at animals in 1980 was that it's an interesting argument that before, sort of in pre-modern times, roughly, meaning when people were living off the land, and some people still do, but generally, when you look at an animal, like a farmer has, even today, a farmer may have no problem with naming a pig or a chicken and, give them a name and then kill them and eat them. Or sell it. That sounds cruel, but actually, it's actually less cruel than pretending we don't see this, and it's all manufactured and then packaged, right? And I know that's one reason, aside from reasons, many, even the West also, many are turning to veganism and so forth. But the point is that Peter Singer made this interesting argument that when we look at an animal returns our gaze, there's sort of an uncanny moment, because on the one hand, we feel a kinship, right? I mean, it's hard not to look at a puppy and right, feel like, until they grow up. But then we still have, on the other hand, a distance. It's kind of like that uncanny valley of the idea of robots, right? Which was coined by a Japanese critic in the 70s or 80s. This idea that, using the uncanny idea that when we see robots that are too lifelike, it's very estranging because they're familiar on the one hand, but they're definitely different on another. We see this in movies where they do I find it eerie when they have certain, those animated movies where they take actors and then they use a kind of animated form of them. And it's kind of like strange. So the same thing happens, he says, with looking into an animal's eyes. These are ways in which, these are very European ways of looking at it. What happens when we look through, say, Native American texts? One reason that made me think of this is we've had a couple of doctoral students in our department. I have a colleague who's a Native American studies expert. And so I sometimes come in for the post-colonial theory content. And so I haven't read these texts, but there's a huge boom in Native American writing, Canadian and North American, by young writers, in which they take certain legendary or folk figures like the Wendigo, which is a kind of monstrous figure, or the White Buffalo Woman. These are mythic ideas, and they put them in the present day, and they become kind of an eco-horror, but they are also a haunting. And I'm just giving you a tidbit here. This idea of haunting about the trauma of what they've been through, but it's not entirely negative. So to that end, I have a couple of images, Ankita, which are just very simple ones. One is Devil's Tower. Yeah. So I was mentioning this the other day. I said there was a legend of the Kiowa, and I was saying it was kind of a heads up for Scott Momaday, and whom we're going to look at. And he talks about this actually in an interview I saw on television, and that you can see how I've been to this at the base. It's fascinating because there's this plain around here, and then suddenly this thing sits up. Right? That's because everything else has eroded around it. So that looks like scars on the side that the legend says, the Kiowa legend says, was made by a giant bear. Right. Now that's important because it's sacred. All the mountains and rivers, we know this in India is true, in many parts of the world, but sometimes North America, the dominant culture forgets that, right? If it's on a reservation, now this is on public government land, but if it's on a reservation, you cannot hike, no outsider can hike on there. So we have a reservation near us, Fort Hall, where you can go just to the entryway, where they have a casino. That's a big thing that Native Americans are allowed to do. But you can't go to further inside without permission. So they are sort of semi-autonomous, but they are spiritual. And that's the reason, right? So, Scott Momaday's House Made of Dawn came out in 1968, and the title is taken from the traditional literature of the Diné people. The Diné is a broad term, and it really just means the people. And Kiowa is one of the sort of clans or subgroups within the larger group. He died just last year at the age of 89. And Joy Harjo, the poet I started this week with, said that, quote unquote, Momaday found a way to move eloquently between oral storytelling forms and the written English novel form. The trajectory of the novel moves from sunrise to sunrise, making a circle, a story structure recognizable in indigenous oral history, yet following traditional American literary shape and the expectations of the novel, of the modern novel. So, House Made of Dawn. I love that poetic title. As Harjo notes, his title, and many others have noted, not just her, she wrote this in tribute to him just last year, but he is credited with inaugurating the Native American Renaissance in writing. And that's pretty recent, right? Late 1960s. Now it's boom time, if you're interested, which I don't read as much of this, but I've taught this novel. It opens with the protagonist named Abel. Has anyone read this? Curious? I'm just curious, that's all. He returns to a reservation in New Mexico. There's another image, I forgot what it was. Yeah, now I remember. So the other image is, we saw the photographs, so we're in the age of photographs, right? But this is I alluded to earlier to the beginning of today, where this is a hand-drawn map, Native American map, from maybe 100 years ago or more. And the topographies are interesting, right? So it's not only giving mountains, which are the triangular shapes, but it also, apparently, this is from a website which I will put in my notes, the link, which is, those are indicators of petroglyphs. Petroglyphs, right? We have them in India to some degree. And that is where we have many of them in North America. Some are etched in and some are drawn in red pigment, ochre. Those are spiritual for them, right? So what matters on a map? Maps are, what is it? It's all cultural, right? It's what we think is important, right? And there you'd say, well, that doesn't look like a map, but it is meaningful to the people who created it a long time ago. So we mustn't think that indigenous peoples did not have maps or did not have petroglyphs themselves were sometimes a marker of place, that they would know where to go. So I thought that was interesting. And by the way, if you're interested, I have the website on the notes, and this is done by sociologists who, not literary critics, who are digitizing some of these and talking about how you can teach them. So it's really interesting. Sort of a cross-disciplinary multimedia. So the other thing about Devil's Tower, may I say, and this you can see is quite distinct from this map, is that we see it in the novel. Somewhere in the middle of the novel it's described. That's why I showed it. But it's also become a kind of, gained a lot of fame in a 1977 film by Spielberg called Close Encounters of the Third Kind. You don't have to go look at this, but this guy is haunted. It's a white guy, a middle-class guy, and he's haunted by these aliens are communicating with him, but he doesn't know it. And so he keeps making shapes, like out of his potatoes and all. He makes shapes that look like Devil's Tower, and he's never seen Devil's Tower. So he takes his whole family and he goes there and so forth. And then an alien ship comes down. Well, the inside story of this is that the location scout, whose name is Joe Alves, he was told to find an unusual piece of topography. So he goes there, and as he's scouting, then he learns, or really after filming, he learns to appreciate and appreciates the spiritual significance of it to the several Native American tribes. So it's ironic that he takes a movie, this modern medium of popular, it's a popular kind of film, and that causes this location scout to really appreciate this landscape. And he says, if this made him think, if aliens were to come, why wouldn't they choose a place like this? It heightened the creative and spiritual sense of the film, which led to it a much bigger film. Though it must be said, Native Americans make no appearance in the film. But still, he learned something. Okay, anyway, back to Abel. He's the other aspect is there's trauma in a lot of these texts. Already he's disconnected from, he's drafted into World War II, right? So this novel came out in 1968, and so it's set more or less in that present. So roughly a little over 20 years before this, he's drafted into World War II. He's crippled psychologically. He doesn't recognize, he's so drunk, he doesn't recognize his own grandfather who helped raise him, right? And this guy, his name is Francisco, and he had taught Abel all the traditions and values of the Kiowa. And these are directly tied to the landscape, right? And so, by the way, independently of this, there's a wonderful series of novels by a white guy, but he was an honorable tribal member named Tony Hillerman that are mystery novels set in this area, the Navajo mostly, but it's very similar kind of landscape if you're interested. They've just recently filmed it with an all Native American cast, Native American director, cinematographer, everything, and they have the spiritual aspects, supernatural aspects that we would say supernatural, are just presented as real. So I just thought that was interesting. Okay, well, to my knowledge, this has not been filmed yet, but there are a lot. That's another area. Some of you are in film studies where Native American film is starting to be important. So the novel his whole idea is the novel is about his really difficult time adjusting both to coming back from World War II, but also he tries to make a go of it in Los Angeles, so that it's a very alienating, like any city, right? And if you go to the new, like you saw Devil's Tower, it's very wide open. It's a very different landscape. So that's going on. And Francisco tells him stories from his life and tells him that you need to reconnect with your people. And when he dies, Abel dresses him for burial and covers his own body with ashes. It's a ritual form. At dawn, he starts to run, enacting the funeral ritual his grandfather had described to him. While running, Abel sings for San Francisco and also for his own soul. So we understand that he's returned to his people and finally understood his place in the world. And place, we sometimes use that very loosely, your place in the world, but this is really place. This is bioregional place. Now, I should say that there's also a motif, there's also a theme about he's a runner. So running was part of this ritual. But he happens to be a runner. They still to this day have this running, what's it called? The Jimenez, anyway, if I see it here in my notes, I'll tell you what it's called. Oh yeah, Jemez, Jemez, Jemez runners. Where some of these traditions have been revived very and really nicely. Where in Fort Hall, I've been to the what is called a powwow. I don't know if you've heard that term, but a powwow is a generic. The Native Americans use it, but they all have different languages. So it's just become a group term for Canadian and American tribes to come together and share dances, have dance competitions, share their wares, and sell some things to tourists, right? But they're not aggressively selling. It's like they're just laid back, and it's really neat to watch that. And the reason I mention that is they also have a bareback horse race, no saddle, and they're usually young people, and they're all on these horses, and they go really fast around this track. So they are keeping these traditions. They're trying. Mama Day's protagonist is a Kiowa Indian who's begun to lose his heritage, as we said. And so we are sort of experiencing this with him. And also, like Chinua Achebe or others, writers, he puts a few terms in the novel that he does not define. We can infer what they are from the context. Some of these terms, for example, are culebra. Sometimes they have Spanish, they borrowed from the Spanish, which is also part of Mexican American. When we get to Native American, this is also Native Mexican American, or what we call Hispanic, Latino, they're different terms, areas. Concho, Hostin, things like that. They also mention, I don't know if you've heard, the word squaw, which is a derogatory term that thankfully very few people are using, but whites had used it for 150 years, thinking, modern whites thought it was, the dominant culture thought it was a legitimate term. Turns out it is a Native American term, but it's more like saying whore. And they use this for all Native American women. So you can imagine, right? The other thing I thought I'd mention, which is to give you insight into how slow things change. When I moved to where I live now, which is also, Native American territory, Pocatello, where Idaho State sits on Native American Shoshone land, 25 years ago, there was a peak, a hill that's a prominent one. There are a few others, and they called it Chinks Peak. If you know American lingo, that is a derogatory term for the Chinese that was used in World War II and earlier. They helped build a railroad that made that a railroad town. There, in front of our building, English department, there's a narrow gauge track from the 1880s that's preserved, a small section, as a memorial, right? Chinese, some Japanese Americans, in other words, if you go to the cemetery, you have gravestones in Chinese, Greek, and so on. And yet they all suffer this discrimination, right? And so until recently, and Chinks Peak, when all of us got there, we're like, what? Where are these people, living? What, this is not what you use. Finally, they changed it to Chinese Peak 4 years after that. So I'm just telling you that there are still a lot of derogatory terms. Okay, the other thing I want to leave you with is this, the idea, and I don't know when I started, but the idea of, the way I read this is that these terms that are not defined are not estranging. I think they are meant to give an air of authenticity, as we've said, but they are not meant, after all, he wants the readers of all kinds to appreciate this world, right? You don't want to alienate the reader. And the irony is that even Abel is having to learn his traditions, right? So that kind of, in a way, invites the reader, the dominant, say the non-Native American reader, to feel empathized with him, because, hey, how do I appreciate this landscape? Some themes and symbols. There's religious syncretism. There's Catholicism and Native American traditions, very common. There are ritual songs and stories. Remember I mentioned animal studies? Eagles and other birds and animals, horses, bears, coyotes, fish. Someone mentioned disability studies. There are damaged bodies. Abel's hands, he also kills a man. That's another part of a story, and so on. Momaday's novel, and I'm coming to the end here, also contrasts the quiet, natural landscape of the reservation with the bustling city of Los Angeles, accentuating how this urban existence is alienating and isolating for Abel, as it is for so many. And like all great novels, writers, he does not romanticize them. And one way, I'll give you one example, he describes Abel's scorn for an albino Indian, right? Troubling. He's not going to shy away from that. Oh, thank you. He's not going to shy away from that. Louise Erdrich, Tracks. Has anyone read Louise Erdrich, I wonder? Erdrich. It's a German surname, but she is part Native American from the Anishinaabe people. There are many, couple hundreds of different clans. There are some large groupings, and I'm not well versed in these myself. The point is, though, the other thing to keep in mind is some tribes are losing their language, others are reviving it. But these were not written languages, right? As we're familiar with that in India, in certain languages, these were oral. So, for example, I had a colleague, he's retired now, he was hired, he left the university for 3 years because he was well paid by one of the tribes to develop a written system, right? So, a linguist, he's a linguist. So, and so they are still trying this, but to my knowledge, I don't think there are any works of fiction in Native. I may be wrong, but not that I've heard of. They tend to be in English. So, the other thing is communal identity. I think we should point. So in Tracks, it alternates between two narrators: Nanapush, a jovial tribal elder, and Pauline, a young girl of mixed heritage. So different tribes have different rules about how much blood genetically you need to be a member of the tribe. I have someone in our department, a doctoral student, to give an example of the complexity, Lawrence, he's very Native American, looks Native American, but he grew up in Los Angeles. He left, his parents grew up on this reservation near us, but since a young age, he grew up in Los Angeles or somewhere like that. He came back to the Pocatello, and they would not allow him to become a member because they said, you have never lived on the reservation. So that's another rule. And he got annoyed. He said, to hell with it. I don't want to become a member. So you can see these tensions today that are part of. I just give you a real life story, right? So Nanapush is telling stories to his granddaughter Lulu about things that happened in the past. So part of the novel is a recollection, and these occurred quite early on, 1912 to 1924. Edrich has, I haven't read all her work by any means. She has a number of, she likes to delve into the history of some of the similar characters, but also in the present. Her first collection, which sometimes it's a novel, described as a novel, but you know how sometimes writers can take different short stories and piece it together to make a novel. So you can read it each chapter independently. It's called Love Medicine, and that deals with, for example, a Vietnam War veteran. Like Abel, he's a kind of updated version, similar version, who's has post-traumatic stress disorder and things like that. You can also, by the way, think of, it's very interesting to see how Native American veterans of the Army are very proud of that service, even as they are ambivalent about it, because they were not accepted, right? When they fought, especially in World War II, as full citizens. And yet they're proud of that. So there's this idea of the ritual aspect, the duty, the idea of duty to a larger cause, but that doesn't take away the fact that they have had to endure racism and so forth. There's also this idea of health and bringing someone who's sick with tuberculosis, treating them. An epidemic has, this is over 100 years ago, these events, even though the novel is published in 1988, where tuberculosis had claimed the lives of some of them. Probably the main emotion in the novel is a kind of shared grief over that loss, over the loss of so many members. So that's that haunting I mentioned. The grief haunts them, right? Now that's very psychological haunting, and I don't believe it takes the form of any particular human or animal, but nonetheless, there. Here's an interesting aspect, though. So Edrich, just like some other writers, will, again, they're not magic realist novels by any means, they're realist, but they will introduce some things that make you think. So what happens is Fleur, this young woman in the family, is at one point beaten and raped by 4 men. So she leaves the town. She's just obviously, I can't imagine that. She leaves the town. The next day, a tornado comes through the town, and the only people killed are the 4 men. Is this divine justice? Right? There's no explanation, right? And there aren't many of these sorts of events, right, in the novel. So it forces you to think about, and that's a natural sort of occurrence, right? It forces you to think about things like fate and so forth. So they begin a new family unit. Notice that, like a lot of Native Americans, they have, I've had students, for example, who will say, we just have, you can sleep in each other's homes in your extended family. It doesn't matter. You come and go, right? And so in this way, you start to have an extended family. It's not that sort of tiny nuclear family like in a city. And a new family unit starts to grow. And throughout the novel, Margaret and Nanapush, he's the key, he's the grandfather, whom Fleur sees as a father figure, he starts to develop a relationship with Margaret. Now, this situation is interesting. Is not. You'll see it. There's some correspondence with Vito Montes' novel Under the Feet of Jesus, which talks about 1970s, 60s, 70s Hispanic, Mexican-American laborers in the fields, where these extended families are what is key. But together, the family has to deal with hunger, tribal conflict, and ultimately the loss of their land to the government. So here's that eco-critical idea. There's also no romanticizing here. Pauline, who does a lot of good, she takes care of people tending the sick and dying. She decides to join a Catholic convent after having a vision, right? So you see all these complexities. But she becomes more and more obsessed with, and also eaten up by jealousy of this other woman, a Fleur. And so you have, this is again 1988, so you have these characters who are trying to make a go of it in a modern world where they still want to cling to things, their traditions, and what makes that, the key tie are stories. We talked about that the other day, storytelling. Right. Like Morrison's Beloved, Tracks presents us with spirits and hauntings which are on one level very real to the novel's characters. On another level, they represent the tensions and traumas, of course, that Native peoples are forced to endure as they face a white settler world that has effectively erased them from its consciousness. For example, Nanapush describes the grief he and Fleur endure, as I mentioned, right? And this is what he says. We had gone half Wendigo. I learned later that this was common, that there were many of our people who died in this manner of the invisible sickness. There were those who could not swallow another bite of food because the names of their dead anchored their tongues. That's grief sickening them. They haven't got tuberculosis. Now, a Wendigo, as I just briefly mentioned earlier, in the lore of many Native American tribes, not all, is a monstrous creature that feeds on humans. A figure whose isolation from others has corrupted its soul, again, because lack of community. That's what happens to Abel, right? This can become a metaphor for the corruption of the human soul. Right? This grief nearly drives them mad. That's why he says, we had gone half Wendigo. He means really almost mad and monstrous. Fleur, after losing a child, seems to drift towards madness. One critic has argued that madness is a manifestation of the Native American community's trauma following the deforestation of their homeland by loggers. A theme that we also see in Mahashweta Devi to some degree, right? So you can make these correspondences. Another scholar, Summer Harrison, notes that Eldridge, like Linda Hogan, Joy Harjo, and others, believes that storytelling, environment, and identity are closely linked, and this is what she quotes Eldridge, an essay by Eldridge, which I haven't read the original essay, but this is what she quotes. Contemporary Native American authors have, therefore, a task quite different from other writers. In the light of enormous loss, they must tell the stories of contemporary survivors while protecting and celebrating the cores of cultures left in the wake of the catastrophe. And in this, there always remains the land. So there's something solid, even if it's being polluted, it's a little more, let's say, it's fragile, but it's a little less precarious than the humans. Harrison cites, I thought this was interesting because I haven't read her novel Four Souls, but she does like what a lot of writers do, uses some of the same characters. And this clues us into the title, Tracks. Nanapush says in this writer, Four Souls, I have left my own tracks too. I have left behind these words. And he's supposed to be speaking orally, right? But even as I write them down, I know they are merely footsteps in the snow. They will be gone by spring. New growth will cover them and me. The green in turn will blacken. All things familiar dissolve into strangeness. Even our bones nourish change. So by redefining words as tracks and deep tracks as a form of print, so he's not, print, but this is the way. He links stories with the material world and also the political context of land use. He draws attention to how modern development affects the earth, particularly on native lands, but also to the historical aware narratives of progress that legitimate that impact, familiar to some of the other works we've taught. This deep printing through stories disrupts both the local woodlands and the communal identity of a people who left no tracks. The deep printing is also, there's another competing printing, which is infrastructure and deforestation and so forth. By comparing his own writing with plant life, Nanapush situates his words and himself in a larger natural cycle of decay and renewal. While he is clearly critical of deep printing, however, he neither calls for a wholesale rejection of modernity, nor offers his own account as a simple alternative. Instead, he self-consciously defines his story as a temporary and partial means of orientation. So Native Americans are known for tracking, right? And some still practice this, a few, where they can they can read the signs. In the American Army in the 1800s used to hire trackers, right? That was how they could find their way, by natural signs. That, of course, is a skill rapidly disappearing. I'm almost done here. Let's see. So he partial means of orientation and as an impermanent but nourishing contribution to storytelling, which is also plant life. So plants, you're planting these stories. Although he acknowledges that his narrative cannot provide an objective or complete account of particular environments or identities, Nanapush's reflections on storytelling throughout the novel suggest the positive value of literary self-consciousness for examining both. Now, we've seen how Gift in Green, Scent of Pepper, this idea of you could look at this as the ways in which humans imprint themselves on the land, right? And make a lasting but productive engagement with the land. And I think that that's a useful way to read this. I also I'm going to continue on my laptop here by I think I did mention the referring back to the map. I forgot to read one paragraph, the hand-drawn map. And I thought this was interesting. This is from the website I mentioned. It's an article, actually, on a website called Art and Argument, Indigitization of a Kiowa Historical Map for Teaching and Research. International Journal of Geoinformation. So we have all kinds of ways. And this is what the authors say. One-way flows of knowledge are revealed when Cherokee or other indigenous informants who provide place names to Apple, Microsoft, or Google on the GPS realize that their own geographies are not represented. They are erased from the maps, hence the religious sites. Indigenous geographies are often trivialized as being local, vernacular, and particular to a culture which goes against the grain of technoscience, standardization, and universalization. So again, these are, some of them are sociologists, some of them are geoscientists who are looking for ways to appreciate these maps, and also they give with pedagogy in mind. So I think that's something we need to keep in mind. So as I wrap up this particular lecture, I've only talked about M. Scott Momaday and two writers, right? Is that right? And Erdrich. There are many, many others, and I'm just not specialized enough to have read all of them. But if you're interested, as I said, eco-horror and speculative fiction by Native Americans as well is a big part of genre and best-selling in some cases. There's also, of course, eco-horror film, which we could talk about, and some Native American film in relation to this. The other thing I wanted to mention was, I think it's worth, this is sort of a footnote, not germane specifically to post-colonial eco-criticism, but certainly just very important, that there's a debate in the US about terminology. So Chicano, Chicana tends to relate to Mexican Americans specifically, but we have immigrants from all over Central America, South America, and so forth. Hispanic tends to be the broader term, right? So Hispanic, sort of the broad term. Then you have the more specific term, Chicano, Chicano, that was used for many decades. Now there's a term Latinx. We had the term Latino, Latina, which still used. But as I have discovered, there's a big debate. A lot of Latinos do not like Latinx. One reason to use the X was to sort of be gender equivalent, but also perhaps also sexually equivalent, right? And it's a noble idea, but I don't know if it's going to catch on. It may, but I'm just letting you know that when we talk, for example, about, I'm jumping ahead to Native Hispanic literature. In the same way with Native American writing, there's a debate. So some of the Native Americans will say, yeah, we'll call us Indians. That's fine. We'll take ownership, even though Columbus was wrong, right? We're going to, but it's one of those cases where the group that's been victimized, rightly so, they have the license to use it as they want. So they'll call themselves Red Man, let's say, right, or Red. But we outsiders have to sort of be careful in how we use it. Same with terms like the N-word for blacks. African Americans use that all the time with each other. This also applies to any minority group, Jews, and others. So I want us to be just sensitive to this fact, because as groups become empowered, words matter, right? And it's hard sometimes to make my students understand that, my dominant white students, from the dominant, from the non-minority, and they can't really say, well, what's the big deal? But the thing is that they do matter, and they can become political, right? So I want us to keep that in mind. I'm coming close to the end here. We just have a few minutes, and there was something else I wanted to mention on the laptop, if I can find it. I think this mostly had to do with, here we are. So one thing that I'll talk about in the next lecture a little more is, remember how M. Scott Momaday is living in what is called New Mexico. I maybe should have put that on the map, which not surprisingly borders Mexico and was part of Mexico until 1848. And so there are Hispanics who have lived in Texas and other places for 4 centuries since the conquistadors came. On the other hand, and they're directly descended from the Spanish, but they're also Mexican, mestizaje. So when we get to the Hispanic literature, this overlaps, because some Native Americans have what we would say mestizaje or Hispanic blood. That's because we have artificially imposed those borders, right, and categories. So when we get to the Hispanic literature, keep in mind that we are not sort of leaving Native American literature behind. There's a lot of overlap. So, for example, I'll talk about this in the next lecture. Gloria Anzaldua's Borderlands book from 1980 is important, and I'll say more about it. But this very idea of borderlands, border studies, which is interdisciplinary, that pertains both to Mexican Americans because of migrations, right? but also Native Americans, because Native Americans still don't like borders. Not all of them were nomadic, some were settled, but when you have a powwow, for example, like where we are, we'll have people come from Canada. Some of them, there are tribes that are the same tribe that are in Canada and North America, just like the Kurds or any, there are many, many peoples around the world who straddle these modern borders. And so that becomes also a metaphor, a motif, and a metaphor as well as a lived reality. So I wanted to mention that. So if now we know that we can look to India for not directly the same thing, but I'm thinking of Amitav Ghosh's The Shadow Lines, right, about the division of Bengal. And that already, or any number of places in the world, right? But here it's continuing to be lived where you are sort of liminal, you're in a kind of liminal state, because some people will see you as unwanted, right? Yet you can say, my family's been here longer than yours. So, so I wanted to mention that. So terminology is crucial, as is the fact that there are many, many other works of literature out there. I will go ahead and stop there. I'm a couple minutes early, but we'll make up for it in the next lecture. Thank you. I think my throat is running dry. Okay, welcome back, everyone. It's 12:30 now, and our third and final lecture for the day, which is technically lecture 12, simply called Hispanic American Voices. I neglected to mention one term from the last lecture, and you'll see a pattern here. I keep coming back to the end of the last lecture that I ended about a couple minutes early because I wanted to mention the term that I think is listed in the somewhere in the outline, and that is the ecological Indian. And I think we have alluded to this in different ways already, but it is simply the idea that the romanticizing of Native Americans, even as they have been pushed to the brink, as a kind of noble savage, right? Totally in touch with nature. And you can see that M. Scott Momaday and others have reacted to this because that dehumanizes Native Americans, right? It doesn't allow them to be, again, agents, as we've been talking about, of their own fate. And so that concept, by the way, is given quite a bit of space in, say, Greg Girard's Introduction to Eco-Criticism, but it's a important motif in North America. One reason is that in the 70s, there was a famous, at the time, campaign for against littering, right? The national parks and all, where they had this famous image that played for a few years of this Native American, very Native American looking man. He has a feather in his hair and all, and he's looking out over the parks, and then he turns this way and you see a tear coming down, right? Now that that was effective, I suppose, but it again romanticizes that notion of the Native American, and he kind of looked like he would fit better in, a century earlier. Secondly, it transpired many decades later that he was not even Native American, the actor, even though he looked it, right? So you can be, there were in Hollywood in the 50s and 60s and even into the 70s, as long as you kind of looked vaguely the part, right? Ironically, Native Americans will sometimes, so I've read in an essay a few years ago, they'll sometimes get together and have fun pointing at these old movies and say, "Oh, there's Uncle So-and-so," and they're and they're laughing. And so there's a book called Real Indians, REEL, and if you're interested, and I know the name of the author so well, but my mind is blank. But he talks about the fact that this idea of the distinction between how the dominant culture views them versus what the reality is, and there are studies about things like on the res, as Native Americans say, on the reservation. And there's a comedy sitcom now, all Native American, which is quite funny. And there's even a dead Native American who comes on a horse and talks to them. There's also a great film from 20 years or over, maybe 25 years ago, called Smoke Signals, which is funny, about modern Native Americans, right? So many of them have, they've struggled with a lot of different issues. So I wanted to mention this ecological Indian as an important trope that I should have said at the end of the last lecture. This does overlap, as I said, with Hispanic Native Americans to some degree. It depends on which group you're talking about exactly. But Jimmy Santiago Baca is an interesting figure whom I didn't know so much about until recently, who, as I said, I had heard some Native American voices, poets talk, and so on, and maybe I had read Scott Momaday, but I hadn't read much Hispanic American poetry. So what's interesting about Baca is he's half Apache, but he's part Chicano. So he is a classic instance of crossing the borders of identity. Now that, that's not that radical or anything, but he also spent 4 years in prison. So he educated himself, and his poems are beautiful, but they're hard-hitting. So here's what, when he exited prison in 1979, he's still writing, at the age of 27, he published his first collection of poems. And his poems speak, as he says in an interview, part of this is the quote. He speaks of painful experiences like racism, isolation, being in prison, and loneliness, but also of hope, faith, and love, as he says. As Frederick Luis Aldama has noted, Baca evokes in his poems, quote, the rhythms and sounds of the everyday life in El Barrio, the Hispanic, often poorer sections of American cities. The barrio is kind of well known in mass culture as a nickname. It's not quite the same as a ghetto, but it's similar. But it also is something that now people, some Hispanics who grow up in those environments will take ownership of, right? And be proud of. And it's working class, especially, this is the Chicana term. So I'll read from one of the poems, at least, in a minute. But Aldama points out that Baca has also written about the arid and scorched land on the Mexican side of the border and the U.S., where factories of American companies exploit men and women. This is well known along the border. Cheap labor, right? The American companies move to Mexico, and the same pollution comes across the border, but also the labor situations are not great. So he evokes these lives as well. In the first of the two poems I assigned, it's called Roots. Baca likens himself to the cottonwood tree in his backyard, a tree whose actions he conveys in violent verbs: knock, mangle, wreck, splinter. The tree is, quote, unquote, a battle-scarred warrior, that the speaker, whom we can infer safely is Baca. It doesn't have to be, but in this case it is. He tends to be autobiographical. Feels he resembles, especially in terms of his Mexican roots. The verbs in the second stanza that characterize Baca's roots are different from those in the first stanza, but no less violent. Barn burners, stuck knife blades, clashing, pierced. The cottonwood tree's actions are part of its nature, though, with no malice aforethought. Unlike the Spanish who came to the region in the 1500s, who behaved like all humans with their own interests in mind, so that the knife and the muskets, he mentions, intentionally this old-fashioned gun, require a hand to guide them to violence. So maybe the wood tree has agency, but it doesn't have malice in its actions. But he sees himself in the cottonwood tree to some degree, right? He sees himself as a combination of these attributes. This is how I read it, as the natural and the social. The Great Black Mesa Plateau, from which he gets this collection, is called Black Mesa Poems. Remember that we have Devil's Tower? You have to imagine it now. There is a large plateau, right? Mesa just means table, and it's similar to the Hindi word maize, right? Indo-European. But mesa is also used in North America all the time as a plateau. So I just wanted to give you this geographical orientation. And this great plateau shadows humans and trees alike, and seems to be a reminder of the comparative insignificance and transience. So the land remains. The second poem, A God Loosened, which I'll read from, is filled with the natural imagery of nature, which mostly seems to celebrate all life forms, even if the speaker likens the woods around his house to the upturned claws of great dead birds. The silent, austerely beautiful scene is abruptly shattered by the noisy flight of a hawk. The latter image and the words around it, shuddering the air with frightful breakage, sound to me like Yeats in many of his poems. But perhaps, and is perhaps like Yeats, Baca reads nature as simultaneously beautiful and dangerous. So it's not unique in that way, with its own being and agency. So let me read this and see what you make of it. A god loosened. The morning quivers softly. The glassy sunlight sparkles into the wet grass. A bluebird flicks from a tree across the marginless blue of the sky. All that drips, glows, hollowing out the full light of life that brightly flashed, and a flickering chill blows the uplifted flame of days shorter and frail. In the upturned claws of the great dead birds that are the snow-weary woods, that's what I was alluding to, surrounding my house, echoes a crumbling and falling of icy sounds, of crisp light leaves, of logs and trunks cracking, and the wings of a hawk, storming from the tangled boughs as if in an underground cavern, shuddering the air, in the frightful breakage of silence that seemed an eternal silence hanging there, and a god itself loosened in those terrible feathers. Also, I hear, not consciously on his part, but I hear echoes of Kolatkar's Jejuri there in his poems, a collection of poems. I don't have a specific interpretation of this because I think it's open to interpretation. What I wanted to illustrate was the fact that the environment, even in his backyard, means so much to him and grabs his attention. Now, one useful way of we always want to compare and contrast, right? And find connections and differences with other specimens of the genre, such as Robert Frost, right? So Robert Frost, a very popular poet around the world, wonderful poems, and he writes about similar things. So we have to ask ourselves, what's different, right? What's here? Now, Frost tends to, understandably, talk about his New England farm where you don't have minorities. It's always European settlers, right? Okay, that's what he was surrounded by. That's fine. Here, I think we have to keep in mind the collection of poems. The setting always is shadowed, as I said, by the Black Mesa, right? And the Black Mesa is home to both Hispanics and Native Americans for centuries. So it's hard sometimes to tell them apart. Because after all, if you go to Mexico, and much of South America, you have the mestizaje culture, right? The dominant culture tends to be, the majority, I should say, are mixed blood, Spanish and indigenous. Then you have the relatively more pure indigenous, who again are at the bottom, tend to be at the bottom, like the Zapateca, and you have the small number of elites. For example, the new president of Mexico is Mexican Jewish. Interesting, right? She seems good. I don't know. It's good to have it's just a statement of an observation. So what you do have movements within Mexico against the mestizaje majority. So it's very complicated. But as far as American literature goes, Baca, as I said, classically represents this idea of borderlands. So let me just read from Gloria Anzaldúa. So border studies, of course, is big and it's not that Gloria Anzaldúa has started this, but certainly her book Borderlands slash La Frontera, the New Mestiza, the New Mestiza. So that's a feminine ending. So intentionally, so she's first of all feminist, but also talking about language. She writes it in both Spanish and English, you know. And here's an example of how she mixes it very innovatively. The U.S. border es una herida abierta. You're saying, wait, what am I reading? Where the third world grates against the first and bleeds. And before a scab forms, it hemorrhages again, the lifeblood of two worlds merging to form a third country, a border culture. Now, this could apply, as I said, to many border cultures. Some other quotes. Borders, and she has poems. Again, it's hybrid genre. Borders, and she's a professor, I should say, or retired now, but borders are set up to define the places that are safe and unsafe, to distinguish us from them. A border is a dividing line, a narrow strip along a steep edge. A borderland is a vague and undetermined place created by the emotional residue of an unnatural boundary. It is in a constant state of transition. The prohibited and the forbidden are its inhabitants. Another quote, this land, and she could be speaking for Baca, this land was Mexican once, was Indian always, and is, and will be again. Defiant. Who is to say that robbing a people of its language is less violent than war? Living on borders and in margins, keeping intact one's shifting and multiple identity and integrity is like trying to swim in a new element, an alien element. The answer to the problem, this is the last quote, the answer to the problem between the white race and the colored, between, as was called, between males and females, lies in healing the split that originates in the very foundation of our lives, our culture, our languages, our thoughts. A massive uprooting of dualistic thinking in the individual and collective consciousness is the beginning of a long struggle, but one that could, in our best hopes, bring us to the end of rape, of violence, of war. Powerful, hopeful, but she's hard-hitting in many parts of it. And again, she mixes Spanish with this unapologetically. That's the key, right? Another thing I'd like to read before returning to Baca, and I just have a couple things to say about him, is that one, we can also extend this to Latin American literature at large. Remember I said that there's Hispanic, which is broad. There's the more specific Chicano or Latino, Latina, or describes it thus. The communal cultural historical significance of the physical environs is also reflected in what is the subject of my investigation, Mexican-American literature and literary history. There, the land and the nature and Mexican-American characters' relation to them. Often one of close rapport has been a prominent theme. Okay. The non-human world already plays an important part in a 1542 text he cites. Kind of obscure one at the moment. The Chronicle of the Spanish Explorer, it's by Cabeza de Vaca. He's still very infamous, but he was a Spanish explorer. But specialists read his journal. His 8-year odyssey from Florida through the parts of the present U.S. Southwest into Mexico is one of the earliest known Hispanic writings about the later U.S. and may be considered the foundational text of Mexican-American literature. Interesting, by a Spaniard. It is also one of the earliest expressions of the great U.S. tradition of writing about nature. In his text, Cabeza de Vaca describes the wild nature of the Caribbean and the North American mainland, their topography, flora, fauna, and climate as a powerful presence. We talked about the Caribbean writers. Here, this reiterates that. He dwells on the challenges and perils nature poses to Spaniards as well as to the autochthons. I don't like that word, from the Greek word autochthonous. It's hard to pronounce, but it means indigenous, original inhabitants. An instance is his vivid account of the destructive impact of a Caribbean hurricane on his journey. It is one of a number of first written descriptions of the American lands found in this text. And he also talks about the hardships as well as the fitness for cultivation of the land. And he expresses wonder at the landscape as he travels through present-day Florida. This is what he calls it: a country that was marvelous to see, filled with large forests and amazingly tall trees, where there were Native Americans living, right? The Seminole tribe especially. So I thought I'd share that. And now what I'd like to do, well, let me just mention Baca for a second, because I want to read another poem. Here. So Baca, just to reiterate, he's got dead birds as well as live birds, but he's got images of that are kind of violent, as I said, as well as benign, right? So he's not gonna, these are mixed together. Breakage, frightful breakage, upturned claws, but it's also in his backyard that is something that would normally invite a kind of peaceful image, right? And so by backyard, he does mean literally his backyard, but metaphorically, that area of the Black Mesa, right? In whose shadow so many people live. First, the original inhabitants, both Mexican and his Native American, but now many others, right, where it's developed. Here's another poem. In terms of, as you can see, I've been trying to also look back at some of the, just to give us an overview, a context for this. Read from a poet I mentioned, I don't know if it was yesterday or the day before, Jose Marti, the great Cuban writer who lived only from 1853 to 1895. So he died just 42 or something. But he's the national poet of Cuba. But he also is recognized throughout the many parts of the Hispanic world, Latin American world, as being an important voice for independence in the late 1800s. By independence meaning ostensibly these countries are independent, but it's the rich who control them, right? It's neocolonialism. He even goes to New York, by the way, and lives there for a couple of years. There's a famous song that was popularized in America in the 1960s. My students never know it, which is Guantanamera. But if you're interested, look it up. It's a wonderful song. My daughter was in Cuba for 4 months as a student. And apart from Che Guevara, who's very famous, there's this song is still sung a lot, Guantanamera. And it was popularized by folk singers in the 1960s and also by Jose Feliciano. And I can see I'm kind of going off the topic, but let me read the original of it, which is by Jose Marti. And the song, if you hear it, it's very catchy. It adapts this. So it's not, you won't hear the exact same words. Also, it's in Spanish. But I'm going to read, I'm not a Spanish reader, but it starts, Yo soy un hombre sincero. I am a humble, sincere man. I'm a sincere man. And that's sort of, he doesn't give it a title, so it's just the title from this. And that does come up in Guantanamera. I would sing it for you, but I don't know all the words. From the land where palm trees, I want you to hear the arboreal and floral imagery. And it's about a longing for home and a celebration of this Cuban home. From the land where palm trees grow, I am a sincere man am I. This is how it's translated. from the land where palm trees grow, and I want, before I die, my soul's verses to bestow. So it's in rhyming, and the translator has kept the rhyme. I'm a traveler to all parts, and a newcomer to none. I am art among the arts, with the mountains I am one. I know how to name and class all the strange flowers that grow. I know every blade of grass, fatal lie and sublime woe. I have seen through dead of night upon my head softly fall rays formed of the purest light from the beauty celestial. I have seen wings that were surging from beautiful women's shoulders and seen butterflies emerging from the refuse heap that molders. I have known a man to live with a dagger at his side and never once the name give of she by whose hand he died. But very romantic. Twice for an instant did I my soul's reflection espy, twice when my poor father died and when she bade me goodbye. I trembled once when I flung the vineyard gate, and to my dread the wicked hornet had stung my little girl on the forehead. I rejoiced once and felt lucky the day that my jailer came to read the death warrant to me that bore his tears in my name. I hear a sigh across the earth. I hear a sigh over the deep. It is no sign reaching my hearth, but my son waking from sleep. If they say I have obtained the pick of the jeweler's trove, a good friend is what I've gained, and I have put aside love. I have seen across the skies a wounded eagle still flying. I know the cubby where lies the snake of its venom dying. I know that the world is weak, and that must soon fall to the ground, then the gentle brook will speak above the quiet profound. While trembling with joy and dread, I have touched with hand so bold a once bright star that fell dead from heaven at my threshold. Oh, my brave heart on my brave heart is engraved the sorrow hidden from all eyes. The son of a land enslaved lives for it, suffers and dies. All is beautiful and right, all is music and reason, and all like diamonds is light that was cold before its season. I know when fools are laid to rest, honor and tears will abound, and that of all the fruits, the best is left to rot in holy ground. Without a word, the pompous muse I've set aside and understood. From a withered branch I choose to hang my doctoral hood. So it ends there. On a branch, from a withered branch, I choose to hang my doctoral hood, which is the hood you get hooded at when you become a PhD.
What's the title of the book?
Oh, the title. Sorry, I was wondering. Yeah, the title is actually it's just called it's called Guantanamera sometimes, and sometimes it's called by the first name, Yo soy un hombre sincero. And again, this adaptation became a popular folk song. What's interesting is, here's a footnote. Guantanamera means the person from Guantanamo. And we don't have to say what Guantanamo is, which is a sad corruption of what is a very nice place, actually. The American military took over and made it into a prison. So that was he wrote this before that, but that's what it means. So that becomes all the more poignant in present-day Cuba. Right. What I wanted to say was that you see some similar imagery to, of course, Baca, but Martí was important for a lot of countries because he talked about he has a famous phrase, our America. So America had already become in the 19th century when we say America, that's really it's kind of like the United States co-opting a term that really should apply to, and does, apply to the Americas. So he consciously, through language, says we have to, as best he can do through language, we have to not recapture, but to find a way to have access to the language that America has used, has co-opted for its own. Does that make sense? So the United States of America, sometimes called American, but what does it mean to be American? Right? We had Vespucci's map, Vespucci on the map, I mean, Vespucci on the engraving, the map maker, and that's telling, right? Because the European map then gives the name to the lands. So how do you change that? The Aboriginals in Australia have to do the same, right? You have to, naming is such a big part of this. So that's one of the things he was self-conscious about. The other thing is he's talking in metaphors. When he talks about his son and daughter, it's not, in this case, real. He's trying to be the voice for the Americas that are subjugated. Now, on one level, he's Cuban, so he's talking about his homeland, the palm trees, from the land where the palm trees grow, but he's also conscious that this can be many places. So he's working on two levels, and he's not strictly autobiographical, it's more collective. Does that make sense? So you have to read it metaphorically. So he's the son of a land enslaved, and so he's going to work for that. What I find fascinating is this occurs, he's contemporary with, as I mentioned, Jose Rizal, who died executed in the Philippines, and also wrote in Spanish. So the Spanish-speaking world is interesting, right? It's cross-oceanic. It's when you go to Manila, you go to say Colombia, and you go to southwestern U.S., you see the same architecture, and you say, or Goa, and then you say, wait a minute, I'm having deja vu, right? Uncanny. That's the power of place, but that's the built environment, right, that humans have built intentionally to kind of replicate themselves. Just as coins, I'm getting a little off topic, but just as coins were used by kings to spread their message, right? That was the social media. That was Snapchat. No, I don't know, of the time. Okay, now we go to Helen Maria Viramontes, Under the Feet of Jesus. What's interesting is that she now is not part Native American. She's but Baca speaks for Hispanics, to be sure, but she is purely Mexican American. But what's interesting is even as we saw with Mamade, we have Christianity playing a role mixed with indigenous religions. Here, you don't get that. You don't get indigeneity in the same sense because these are Mexican immigrants. But notice the title, Under the Feet of Jesus, which becomes a metaphor as well as literal. So the summary is California migrant farm workers. Very big topic in the United States. In my campus, there's a name given to a famous farm worker activist, right, who has died a few years ago. But this was a time, which I learned much later, a time in the 50s and 60s when Mexican-American activists were marching for civil rights for the farm laborers who were paid in pittance and were, getting pesticides. So this has pesticides in it, the novel. And it focuses again on a young girl, Estrella, a 13-year-old girl. And by the way, Estrella means star, right? So keep that in mind. Who with her family must constantly move from job to job. Estrella's father has abandoned his family of 5 kids, leaving their very religious mother, Petra Rock, to raise them. She takes as a partner Perfecto Flores, the perfect flower, but he's a man, who helps raise the kids. The book begins with Perfecto driving Estrella and her family in an old beat-up car in need of a new battery to the newest job opportunity, working the grape fields. The family moves into a decaying bungalow near an old barn, which itself is a symbol of dilapidation. So she has, again, this extended family. Two cousins arrived, and one of them she becomes close to, and of course the parents don't like this, right? But they're kind of out in the middle of this farmland. They're kind of cut off from everyday life. And Perfecto has become a live-in partner, and he's a good guy, but he's a live-in partner of the mother. And he's saving up to try to return to Mexico. Now, we have a lot of workers still to this day. I remember we had someone who worked in our house with digging up the yard, the ground for piping and all. And we've talked to him a lot, and he's very industrious. He's a Hispanic, Mexican American who is undocumented. So he has to be careful about where he opens a bank account. This is a common part of the U.S., in the U.S. But his children have gone to college and, done very well. But many of them are sending money, as you know, back home. As we know this about many migrant workers. But the sad thing is that Jose, whom we know, can't return home because he couldn't be able to come back to the U.S., right? And remember the borderlands? There's a lot of, as you know, like refugees crossing into Europe. It's the same way where they'll pay someone to take them across, and it's very dangerous. In fact, anyway, yeah, I could say more about that. But so this is set some time ago, but the novel came out in 1995, but it's set in the 70s, I think. But the point is, it's not set in the present, but things are slightly better for the laborers, but it's still tough. Now, at some point, Alejo, who's the cousin she likes, is accidentally doused with pesticide from a plane in a peach orchard, and he is bedridden. He gets very, very sick. He gets worse. So they take him to a clinic, and all they say is, oh, you got to be in the hospital, right? And so they try to charge them money because they don't have insurance. And Estrella gets so angry that she takes a crowbar and smashes the table. This is the young girl, right? And she's sort of sticking up for the family. And she smashes the table and orders the nurse to give them back their money. Now they're worried that the police might come and so forth. So these are the kinds of experiences that happen. Perfecto begins to cry. So here's the sort of the man of the house, and he's a decent guy, but it's intentionally in this sort of making the man of the house cry versus the woman. And Petra turns to prayer, and this is what happens when she goes to pray in the church and accidentally knocks down the statue of Jesus. And she says, what's interesting about the title, it's also literal. Under the feet of Jesus, it turns out, are some documents that she has hidden. Right? So she, however, is so devout that she feels, oh, this is terrible, right? And so she's kind of gets into a depression. But on the other hand, they find these documents, Estrella does, and that will potentially help them. But at the end of the novel, it's rather poetic. She goes to the barn roof, which is the dilapidated symbol of dilapidation, goes to the top of it and looks at the stars. And her name is Estrella, right? So this identification with nature. Now, what's interesting is I don't know quite there are different ways to interpret this because they are not in a homeland. They are suffering from pesticides, right? Being dropped from airplanes. And this is again in the 60s and 70s where there's no protection. It's potentially going to kill Alejo, the young man. And yet there's this connection to nature in some way, right? So I'm not sure, there are different ways to read this. But you can see the issues of how post-colonial critique works, right? The dominance here. And you can also see this idea of the term that we use a lot these days, rightly so, is precarity, this precarious existence that is almost hand to mouth, and it is sometimes a matter of life and death, right? But it also has themes of literacy as empowering. So, for example, there's this section that says, she lifted the pry bar in her hand, felt the coolness of the iron and power of function, weighed the significance it rewarded her, and soon she came to understand how essential it was to know these things. That was when she began to read. Interesting conjunction. So this kind of crowbar thing, a tool, and she intuitively understands, Estrella does, that she needs to learn to read. There's also the theme of invisibility, of non-white laborers and their exploitation, both physical and psychological. Now besides the pesticide, Petra, who's only a mother who's only in her mid-30s, she was a very young mother to begin with, her legs are already failing her because of the harsh labor conditions. When Estrella thanks Perfecto for driving her sick cousin to the hospital, Perfecto is so taken aback that because no one has thanked him for his 30 years of work in the American farmland. He's never been thanked for anything. So let me read this section. He had given this country his all, and in this land that used his bones for kindling, in this land that never once in the 30 years he lived and worked, never once said thank you, this young woman, who could be his granddaughter, had said the words with such honest gratitude. He was struck by how deeply these words touched him. Getting back to the statue, the documents I knew I was forgetting something. The documents that the mother had hid there were the birth certificates of the children so that they could claim American citizenship, because they then would not be undocumented. But the tragedy is that the mother doesn't she had thought that knocking over the statue was her undoing and so forth, but at least there's hope. So some questions I would ask if I were teaching this would be, how does the novel invite this eco-critical reading, of course, but who benefits from their labor, right? You don't have that many whites here. You do have one or two, but it's clear that their labor, they're being squeezed by a system that doesn't give them much of a leg up, as we say in the U.S. A couple of other themes I'd like to mention, and then we'll see. Advertisements. So here's another conjunction, and it'd be interesting to look at some of these, but I didn't think to you can look at these online. But so California raisins is a big industry. Raisins, you dried grapes. And so there's an ad she describes an ad in the novel of a woman wearing a fluffy bonnet holding out the grapes with her smiling ruby lips. And then the next few lines, pages later, but picking grapes makes Estrella's back coiled like barbed wire. So the conjunction of that, so you don't see, you're on the farmland all the time, but the advertisement, the commodity culture and so forth. Women who labor, so there's a lot of focus on women, and on top of the labor that everyone does, they of course have to keep up the labor of the house. They're expected to. Financial injustice, patriarchal habits, abandonment. So a big theme in some of these novels is abandonment. As the fathers run off, the mothers remain to take care of the children. because after all, her family's position depends on, quote, the harvest, the car running, their health, the conditions of the road, how long the money will hold out, and the weather. Any one of which can knock them off. And this kind of work, of course, is inconsistent because it's seasonal. There's a constant fear. The other thing I would say is a constant fear of, and this runs throughout a lot of modern Hispanic American literature, is the constant fear of immigration and police officers. Immigration officers, police officers. So a friend of mine, unfortunately, it's gotten worse. So a friend of mine in the city of Minneapolis works with, she speaks Spanish, she works with undocumented workers. One day, soon after the new administration took effect, plainclothes immigration officers showed up at the schools where her children were to arrest the parents. They knew that's where the parents would come. And they didn't arrest the children, but where are the children going to go then, right? So it's cruel, it's humane, it's anti-humanitarian. So these things are still there. So I think you could look at African American literature, and film often has this same kind of fear of figures of authority, uniform. We see that in Mahashmita Devi's writing too, of uniform, whether they're forest officers or whatever, police. They use the modern words, right? Police, because those are the modern state ideological apparatuses, right? As Althusser says. So this is very much a strain of fear, I would say, but also resistance and resilience. So we mustn't make it a story of victimology, but nonetheless the reality. Finally, there are biblical figures, because some of the characters are not religious at all, but nonetheless, if they are religious, it's the sort of Catholicism that is important to this family. There's a Moses-like figure, images. For example, she lifted her arms, her palms up, and then spread them wide as the twins watched as she stepped forward, and the glass doors split open before her, obeying her command. And like parting the seas, right? I don't know if you know that image. And also, Estrella parted the doors like a sea of glass and walked through. There's sort of some humor here, too. Other images, interesting. The termite softened, shakes, crunched beneath her bare feet, like the serpent under the feet of Jesus. Or Estrella stood immobile, like an angel standing on the verge of faith. Interesting statements, right? Petra, it's not a religious novel in that sense, typical. Petra begins to question her faith near the end of the novel, as we've said, but at the clinic, Estrella decides that God was mean and did not care, and she was alone to fend for herself. Right? So it's this idea, again, a young person's view of, as in many post-colonial novels, right? A young girl's point of view, perhaps. There are some unglossed words, a couple of which, maybe only one of which, is known in American sort of everyday culture, mainstream culture. There's the pescadores. These are the pickers of fruit and vegetables. The one that's known, unfortunately, is la migra, capitalized, which is slang for U.S. government enforcement, border agents. La migra. Very well known in the U.S. I mean, by everyone. But there's also la Virgen, the Virgin Mary, nopales, shoots, the shoots of a prickly pear cactus, which you can buy in the stores all throughout the U.S. because Mexican Americans eat them, and apparently they're quite delicious. I didn't know this word before, but cicadas, they eat cicadas. Chicaras. Chanclazo, slang for being whacked by sandals. Combining the words, two different words, and comal, a cast iron cooking skillet. Now, one reason I mention that is because, and we have a lot of students like this who have, we have the phenomenon in the modern world of mixed languages and like English, right? So you have Spanglish, and you have a lot of English mixed with Spanish, so that sometimes if some students will go back, say they're citizens and they can go back to, say, Mexico or wherever their parents are from or relatives, they'll be kind of laughed at. So it's interesting that the subject position changes. So when they go there, though, they accentuate their Americanness, because sort of like we're the cool Americans, right? And they've told me this, right? But when they're in America, they have a different subject position, right? And so then they're kind of not on a par with everyone. I think it's changing for sure. We have a lot of throughout the U.S., almost every state except maybe Hawaii and Alaska, we have farm laborers who are Hispanics, and their children now are in the school systems and coming to our university, and they're doing quite well. And so it's interesting to see that generational change, but they are still sometimes not counted in the census because if their parents are undocumented, or they sort of keep a low profile, but I think it's getting better. So I wanted to mention that. The other thing about, let me see if there was another note I wanted here. So as we, the thing with, so when we come back and sort of round out today's lectures, what I'd like to reemphasize is this idea of post-colonial environments, and maybe I thought it might be good to see what, if I can find it here. There's a wonderful story. I wish I had time to read, but no time. It's a longer one. Sorry, I just had it here. Yeah, here we go. So, Pablo, just as a kind of closure to today, zooming back out, there are many books available on these subjects. More specific books would be, if I can mention a couple, anthologies, which are very useful, and I haven't looked at them all. And these are three that are fairly recent. In order of appearance, one is Ecological Crisis and Cultural Representation in Latin America, Eco-Critical Perspectives on Art, Film, and Literature, 2016. Another one is the Latin American Eco-Cultural Reader, 2020. And a third is Hispanic Eco-Criticism, 2019. What's interesting about the last one, as I discovered, was that by Hispanic it includes Spanish from Spain, but it does include the Americas. So that's even wider ranging. But it's by a noted critic named Jose Manuel Marrero Enriquez. I like that long name. And he is Spanish. He often writes from Spain, and he writes in Spanish, but this is in English. So there are many works on Hispanic literature in Spanish from the Americas, understandably, other parts of the Americas, but it's a growing field. That's what I wanted to mention. The other thing I thought it would be useful to do is Pablo Mukherjee, who's a prominent post-colonial critic, has worked on books in different areas. So his 2010 book is still valuable. He reads Amitav Ghosh, Indra Sinha, and so forth. And what he says here, I thought might be valuable. Well, he quotes Graham Huggan, who I mentioned in passing the other day, who talks about the post-colonial exotic. So now we talk about what are the novels, that sell. So, for example, Jimmy Santiago Baca is not someone widely. First of all, poetry tends not to be as widely read as the novel. Many theories about that. Anyway, secondly, it's just there are sort of these larger. There sort of seem to be a handful of writers who attract and get taught, and then that becomes part of this exotic. What the argument is that, which Pablo Mukherjee picks up from Graham Huggan, is that some of these writings, and I think this pertains more to some of the, not to the ones I just discussed today, but perhaps to the more recent novels like Indra Sinha's novel or some of the others, would be a kind of calling attention in their own, sometimes exaggerated scenes, calling attention to the exoticism of so-called third world, which we don't use anymore, but that's what they want to do. They themselves are exaggerating this to sort of say, hey, is this what you think of us? Okay, here's what you go. And then you have to read between the lines. I'm thinking of Garcia Marquez's Chronicle of a Death Foretold, where it's a wonderful, I love the way he works with memory, right? But at the same time, it works on the trope of honor, avenging honor, right? He kind of has fun with this. So there's an argument to be made that perhaps in some of these novels, not all, they are not necessarily all earnest. And again, I don't think this applies to the ones I've talked about today. And I don't think you have to be self-conscious, sort of coy and wry about it. But there is an argument to be made where, say, Arundhati Roy or an Indra Sinha may be exaggeratedly presenting exaggerations or dramatic scenes and having fun with them, like the picaresque idea, in order to call attention to what the mainstream media, especially the Western media, does by commodifying and this exotic stuff, selling it. Does that make sense? So it's better for you to read this on your own. And so this is on pages 8 and 9 mostly of 8, 9, 10, 11 of his book in his introduction. So I thought I would mention this. And then he talks about the literariness of Indian literature and a lot of literature. So there's also a kind of, remember I said that, and I'm almost done with my thought here. I said that there's a lot of popular Native American writing that takes their folk traditions and dramatizes it. Eco-horror, right? And it's taking these guys know, these writers, they're writing for a broad audience, right? So they know that they're playing with a kind of trope that can become kind of trite. That is to say, the horror film, like the typical Hollywood horror film, is very, predictable, and it's about screaming and all this stuff. Well, they're going to take that and play with your expectations about what that means. And so sometimes in a typical if you're looking at a typical film, mainstream media, and it has a ghost, it's not like expecting you necessarily to believe in those ghosts. It's working off the dramatic scare tactics, right? Whereas in these, a spirit or a ghost may be taken at face value, right? It becomes a more philosophical idea. So I just wanted to say that they are using these genre modes, and there's still a bias against genre writing versus literary writing that I think it'd be nice to break down more between popular and genre. Now, that's not to say there's a lot of bad popular writing, but there are some very clever ways of playing with that, which points to also the expectations of the publishing industry. After all, this is a market. You can never forget that, sadly. So that's why someone like Jean Toomer Kane doesn't really become famous, influential till later, it's not written with the intent of selling. So I'll stop there. Thank you very much. And I believe that's the end of lecture 12. End of day 4 on our journey through the apocalypse. And I'll be here again tomorrow morning, a little early. If anyone wants to come and chat.